Hello everyone. Now the fun part begins. We're going to start doing rendering and lighting and making a very nice scene. And the first thing I want to do is uncheck this camera so we can move around the scene. I want to get rid of this floor object and drop a plane in instead right here. Now we're going to make what is called is a white cyc. It's a floor and it's in a wall. It just kind of slowly slopes upward, very gradually. And then you don't see the corner of where the floor meets the wall. And it's a very nice way of just giving it, just a nice background that you would see in studios if you were shooting these as products. And the really easy way to do that is when you have a plane object, you can use a deformer to create that cyc effect on the plane. And the first thing you do is, the first deformer you have in this deformer menu is a bend, which is exactly what you want. And when you drop it in, like this happens, it becomes a cube. Nothing happens with a deformer until it becomes a child of the object it's deforming. So I'm going to drop it in to the plane object like that. And now if I go to the attributes of the bend and hit strength and I drag it up, it'll bend the plane like that, which is not really what you want. And the really nice feature that Cinema has is when you drop a deformer in, you usually want it to be as large, the same size as the parent. And so it has this button right here just called Fit to Parent, which is great. So I hit that button and it becomes the exact size of its parent object. And because it's a plane, it technically has zero distance in the y-axis. So the bend deformer has that as well. But you want to have it be a little bit like that. You want to increase the y value. And now that you have that, we can go to strength and see how it actually bends the plane. And that's obviously not what you want. What's going on is the axis of bending the plane is right here, and you want it to be rotated. So the easy part is you can just go to the rotate tool, make sure your bend deformer is selected, and while holding shift and rotating, you can rotate in 10-degree increments. So we'll rotate to 90 degrees, so it's facing upward like that, which is good. And then let's see, we can make this a little bit larger, and we can also make the strength 90 degrees as well. So it starts flat and goes exactly vertical. And you can see these jagged lines right here. That's because there aren't enough segments in this plane object. And by selecting the plane object and going to any one of these view modes that have lines involved, you can see how many lines or segments there are in this plane object. And I'm just going to go to hidden line. I like that the most. So you can see how it's stretching these segments, and it goes back to normal once it is outside of the deformer's influence. And the really nice thing is, because it's a plane object and it hasn't been made a polygon object, it's still parametric, you can just go in here and add segments like that to make it more gradual. And it's also, you can also resize this plane object to be what you'd like. So I like that. I'm going to move it so it's like this. And that's getting to be, it's definitely pretty big, but it's getting to be closer to what you want. And you can make it smaller. You can make this bend smaller by just decreasing the x value to be maybe like that. So it's very gradual. Going back to the camera. Let's see how it looks now. I'm liking that. That's a good spot. Okay, great. So there's your background. The scene has been set. We need to turn on the bottles and put them all into the 6-pack. And the easiest way to do that is to go to the top view and just select this null object with the bottle, the label, and the bottle cap. And by holding down Command or Control on Windows, you can just click and drag and make copies. And just to give some variation, just rotate the bottles just a little bit. Okay, perfect. I'm just going to place the camera like this and then rotate this 6-pack and everything from there. And what I'm going to do, just because I have now everything inside of this 6-pack, to make it easy to move around and rotate for placement, I'm just going to drop a null object in and call this 6-pack plus bottles. And what I'm going to do first, just to make sure that the null object is exactly in the middle of the 6-pack case, I'm going to make it a child of the 6-pack case. And by doing that, I can zero these coordinates out and this null object will take on the same exact axis center as the 6-pack case. And we're going to make that the axis center of this whole group. So now I'll drag it out, capitalize this, and it can just drop everything into it now, and all these 6 bottles as well. So now this null object is the group, and we can move it around and stage it the way we want with the camera. See, I kind of like that. And then, see, the bottle could go right here. Like that. We could even do another bottle and rotate it to be laying down to show off the bottle cap if you wanted to. Could be like that, and then we could do that. That's a good scene right there, but the framing of the camera isn't very heroic. It's a default focal length, which is 36 millimeters. And the nice thing about cinema is it has these kind of presets for focal lengths that mimic real-world prime lenses you would find in film cameras or still cameras. And it's a really nice way of getting a very realistic-looking framing for your camera. The only problem is that typically for product shots like this, you don't use a wide angle like this classic 36 millimeter lens. You'd use a 50 or an 80. In some cases, if you wanted to, you could do a telephoto lens, which is really, really zoomed in. So I like to use as far as the sensor size, I like to use the 35mm movie sensor size. And you can see once I select this, how it actually zooms in like that. It's because it's cropping the image. And you can see how this behaves just like an SLR camera or a film camera. When the sensor size has been changed, the focal length changes, and it gives you an equivalent as if this sensor size was back on the photo setting. So you can see how it changes back. And it's nice because I like setting it to movie, and you can see how the focal length is now it's almost 60 millimeters, which I think is nice and tight, and I think it's a nice framing. It's a nice hero shot type view through the camera. And if we kind of want to get a little bit lower and then rotate upwards like that, and just a little bit up like that. Okay, that's nice. I'm going to go and back to Garo shading. So now you can see how this is going to look laid out. I'm actually going to, now you can see that bottle cap texture. I'm going to rotate the bottle so it's not exactly like this, but maybe like that. And then rotate this bottle to get that label exactly the way you want it. Like that. That's a nice setup, I think, for the 6-pack case. And one thing I want to do, there's two ways you can go about it. I personally think this type of beer would have a dark glass bottle. So, because you could go through and make another lathe object of the liquid in the bottle. But I think in this case, there would be a dark colored glass, so you wouldn't actually see the liquid in there. And so what I'm going to do is show you how to change the color of the glass, and it's a little bit counterintuitive because you don't actually go in and change the color of the glass right here in the color channel. You actually go in the transparency channel and change the absorption color and the absorption distance. This is where scale becomes a really big deal because it's going to be calculating how light travels inside this distance of the glass to see how much color gets diffused through that. And so by default it's set to white, which means it's just perfect glass. And if I turn on this interactive render region, we can start messing with the glass setting. I really just need a little bit of a scene, a little bit of the window for rendering. Okay, so we can start there. So change the absorption color to really kind of a dark brown. Like that. See how that changes, but the absorption distance is really far. It needs to be like 1 inch or even 0.5 inches. But we can change that, and you can see how this color changes. It's very much thicker now, and you'll see how this changes the color of the glass as well. That's nice. I'm gonna go down here and check this part of the glass. See how that looks. That's okay. It's still a little bit too transparent. Gonna have to reduce the absorption distance to be a lot smaller. So let's see. I'm gonna turn this quality down a little bit, and I'm just gonna do 0.25 inches and see how that goes. That's nice. It's nice and dark. Just for fun, I'm gonna do 0.35 inches. That's not bad. I'm gonna try this bottle. I'm gonna do the whole thing. It's a little bit too transparent. So I'm just gonna go in and do 0.2 inches. And we'll be almost there. It's still a little bit too transparent. See, the funny part is you could actually turn off this transparency and just keep this color and put it in the color channel. But that wouldn't be photoreal. So go in and do 2.1 inches. That should be enough to hide it. There we go. Because you can see through the back of this. You can see the six pack. So that's kind of what I'm using as a judge to make sure that you don't see it or you barely see it. And I'm liking how that's looking. That's nice. I like that. It's subtle too. I like how it's subtle. You can see just a little bit of that six pack case behind it. Great. I'm gonna save that, and I'm gonna turn on a couple of render settings now to really start nailing down the way this is supposed to look. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the way these lights work with reflections. You can see those dots in the reflections. Those are the samples of the light as it gets spread out from the source. And you can turn those samples up, and of course the render time gets more. The render time increases. But when you turn on one of these really powerful render settings I use every time, that stuff goes away. It's really nice. And so here we are in the render settings. And the first thing I want to do is change the renderer from standard to physical. And if I go, and you can see this option appears, if I go into physical, all you really have to worry about right now is the sampler and the sampling quality. And I like to keep it you can get away with low for most things, especially now, and as you're developing a look and everything, you don't need to turn it all the way up to 11 until you're ready to render. And the nice part is you don't have to really do a lot to make it a super nice render. You really just get your look down, get everything you want set up for, get everything you want to do for the render, and then when you're getting ready to make the final render output, you can just change this from low to medium or even high, but I've actually just been fine with medium, and then hit render and walk away. So I like how that physical render is set up in that way. We can use that, and then we're going to use one more thing called global illumination. And what that does is it calculates how light bounces around the scene and off of objects and onto other objects. It's one of the really powerful photoreal settings you would need to get a very nice render. And so we can turn that on and change it to the physical render engine. And those are the two things you really need to really step up your render. And so now if I hit render on this whole scene, this happens at the very beginning. And what that's doing is it's looking at, you can see a little bit of light and everything around here, and a little bit of color. What that's doing is it's calculating the light that's being emitted from the area light, and then how it hits all the objects, and then how it bounces around onto everything else, and you get these very nice subtle color splashes on different objects as the color of, like, say the color of this yellow of the six pack bounces off onto the ground or onto the other bottle. It's very subtle. It's very nice. It adds a lot of realism, and of course it takes a long time to render. That's pretty nice. It's definitely a good start. And that's only one light in the scene, so I think that's in a really good spot. I like how this looks. That's very nice. This is what I was talking about earlier. These dots are the samples that the light is emitting, and it's just not very realistic. That's obviously not how an area light looks. But there are ways to fix that, especially when global illumination is turned on. One thing that global illumination does, or we call it GI, one thing GI does that's really amazing is it actually takes images and can use images as a light emitting source. And the luminance inside the image, or the bright areas inside the image, actually are the sources of light. And it's very, very powerful. The best way to really use GI with image-based lighting is what it's called, is with a 360 degree high dynamic range image, or a 360 HDR. And they can be found online and they can be bought. I personally enjoy Grayscale Gorilla's HDRI kit, and they've provided over 200 HDR images with very high bit depth, super, like very professional, really amazing assets to have. And I'm going to show you real quick what GI can do. And I'm just going to put a torus in the scene like that. I rotate it just like that. And what I'm going to do is I'll make a material, and I'm going to turn this off and just turn on luminance. And you can see how it goes bright white, and then it just goes on this luminance color right here. Obviously, you can pick whatever color you want, and it becomes that. And you can see how there's no shadows or anything on this. When the luminance channel is turned on, it's just like a solid color. So if I drop this on to the torus and do that, and with the default render settings set up, and I just hit render, that happens. And it's pretty ugly because the standard render settings don't incorporate GI by default. So if you go in here to render settings, and we can change the renderer from standard to physical, and then add the effect of global illumination to the scene, and look what happens when I hit render now. So it's calculating how this light from this source is bouncing on the ground and everything around the scene. So that is now the light source in the scene, and you can see how it's kind of emitting this very soft light onto the floor. And I'll just make a material and drop it in. So that's really pretty. Even just right away, it's a very cool, realistic thing. You just have to, when you make renders of anything, GI needs to be turned on. So that's what GI can do with just a solid color turned in onto the luminance channel. But what happens when an image gets turned on, mapped onto the luminance channel? And what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you that by just dropping a sphere in the scene. And I'm just going to map a 360 HDR image onto that sphere. So we go to luminance and go to this bar, select that, and I've just got an image right here. So EXRs are really powerful file formats for high bit depth images. So I have an EXR. This is actually from Grayscale Gorilla's HDR kit. It's one of my favorites. I dropped it in. It's got 32-bit depth as opposed to 8-bit depth. That's typically what you would find in a JPEG is 8-bit depth. But you need a high bit depth image and a lot of information in that image in order for it to work correctly in a GI setting. So I added this image to the scene, and I'm going to change this back to white. And you can see how the sphere now has that image mapped onto it. Now if I just drop that in, and you can see how it's been applied, and the entire image is mapped on, and it's a full spherical image of that scene, which is exactly what you want. You need to have something that's a 360 image so you can see everything. Now if I hit render, look what happens. So you can see how the luminance values of that image are actually emitting light from that sphere, and the luminance value and the luminance color of this image dictate how much light and what it looks like as it gets emitted out. So I'm just going to rotate this to right here so you can see the kind of brightest part of this image and how it emits light. And also what you can do in the material settings, when you have this luminance turned on, you have this setting right here called illumination. And this actually lets you control how much GI is emitted from this object. So I'm going to uncheck receive GI because it doesn't need to be a part of that calculation. And just, we don't need this either, so I turn those off. And then GI area light is something that's really powerful. That treats any kind of luminance values or anything that's in this material, it treats it more as a light source, which is what it is, than just kind of like a glowing object. So you have generate GI area light turned on, and I'm just going to up this strength to 130%, and you can see how much of a difference that makes. You can see right here too, because the illumination's been turned up, there's more light bouncing off the floor and everything in the scene. That's super cool. I think that's really nice. Very complex color changes and realistic glow, fall off, all that. It's very cool. I'm going to use this in the scene for the 6-pack just to give it something very unique and to give a lot of unique lighting changes and color changes in the scene. Also, what's really great about 360 images in your scene are when you have reflective surfaces like that glass in the 6-pack scene, all those reflections are going to be showing up in the bottles in the glass, and that's something that really sells rendered images, I think. And so having a 360 HDR image that emits light in a realistic way and it also shows up in reflections of your objects, those are two very, very important things to achieve realism. So I'm just going to go in here for this blank material and uncheck these things. And I'm going to check luminance and then map that EXR into the luminance channel. And one thing you want to do when you map this on here is this color profile is embedded default, which the color profile that shows up in the EXR is supposed to be the same, but for some reason with these EXRs it needs to be linear and not sRGB, and even when it's supposed to be embedded as linear, it doesn't show up that way. So it's important to change this color profile to linear because that's how the image was set up, and that's going to really add, it's going to make the image very realistic. For some reason sRGB adds a lot of contrast to the image, and so linear is the way to go. So now that's loaded in, we could mess with this illumination and just to see where it ends up. I'm going to do, just for fun, I'm going to do 115%. And I'm going to uncheck this camera. And I'm also going to turn this light off because we don't need it anymore. Okay, so what you're going to see in a second is this 360 image in this entire scene. And the way to do that is to go to here in this drop down and drop in a sky object. Now a sky object is basically an infinitely large sphere that you can't, no matter how far you zoom out in the scene, you can never get outside of that sphere. And what we can do then, now that we have the sky object dropped in, is just drag this material onto the sky object. And now that image has been mapped onto the sky object. Now if we hit render, I'm going to turn off GI just for now because you can still see the image. Hit render so you can see that. Obviously you're not going to really, you're not going to see this hotel room. I think what I really like about this image is this, it's really just a huge soft light from this daylight scene of whatever city that is. I'm assuming it's Chicago. And the cool part now is all we need to do is just rotate this sky object to get the right lighting direction that we want. And I think it would be nice to have that really high source right here. Just this really bright area coming down, this way onto the object, onto the scene. So if we hit render, you can see what this looks like. That's pretty cool. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like when this is changed to sRGB, or even just the embedded default setting. If I hit render, that looks the same. sRGB. It's very contrasty. It's not really what you want for this image, but it looks like the embedded color profile did transfer this time, which is fine. I've gotten used to making sure it's always set to linear, just to know that it won't change. Okay, great. Now I'm gonna go back to this camera. I'm just gonna turn off the transparency on these glass bottles, just to see what this render ends up looking like. That's gonna be super nice. Very, very nice reflections. Now GI is not even turned on right now, but it still looks pretty awesome. So now we check GI, and these presets fine for right now. Typically when I use 360 HDR images, I like to have I like this one. I think it's very useful. That looks really nice. So I'm going to change this to exterior HDR image. That's cool. So I'm going to render the whole scene with transparency turned off, and we get to see how this whole thing looks in full quality. But I'm going to do it in a different way this time. I'm going to do it in a way that I like to use when I do long renders that are just kind of look development renders. I don't want to just hit the render button, because it can start rendering and you can walk away and say you maybe just tap the mouse button. It'll quit. And if you're waiting for a 20-minute render or however long it will take, that can be really frustrating. So what I like to do is go into the render settings, and in output, we're going to change this frame size in a little bit. I think really just right now this is a fine size for the scene. But what I want to do instead is uncheck this save button. So what that is, if I hit this middle button right now, it'll render to the picture viewer. And what that means is it's going to initiate all of these render settings, and including a file path, and actually create a file for the render, which I don't want to do right now. I want to be able to uncheck this button and still initiate all those render settings like that. So if I hit that middle button and hit render like this, it'll render the image out, but it won't save it to the disk. And that's nice, because if we don't like how this looks, we can just make a new render and not save it. Once we get to be more confident about how this is going to end up looking, you can start saving the renders. And the best part too is, say we like this render and we want to save it, we can just right click the file, you can see it right there, and just do save as. So we could actually save the render inside the picture viewer. And that's only if you want to. I mean, I like having this option, because I can't accidentally click the scene with my mouse and stop this render. I've got to actually go into file right here and do stop rendering. So that's nice to have when you want to just see what it looks like without accidentally stopping it if it's going to take a long time to render. And right away it looks pretty nice. Yeah, that looks really nice. I think the only thing really is to mess with the color of this background scene. And I kind of want to make it something a little bit like this yellow. But this is beautiful. I mean, there's no lights. There's just that one 360 image mapped to the luminance channel, and GI is turned on. And all of a sudden you get these really awesome renders. And the reflections are all fed in, like these reflections. Like this is what really sells an image, I think. These reflections. There's reflections right here. So that's nice. I'm not going to save that. I am going to add a material to this scene, and I kind of just want to see what it would look like with that yellow or something close to it. And then obviously change the reflectance a little bit. Just take it off. Just change the reflectance off of the default. Go back to GGX. I actually kind of want to do a little bit of reflection on this. Turn the specular down. Because I think it's kind of cool to have, now that we have an entire environment, the reflections are going to look really nice. I'm just going to turn the render region on and just go back here and just see how this background looks with the reflections. That's not bad. It'd be nice to have a little bit of reflection on the floor right here. One thing cool about the picture viewer too is, you know, you can go back to previous renders and see the differences. That's nice. It's definitely getting there. Maybe a little bit more of a vibrant yellow for the background. But you can see how I like this shadow right here. I'm actually going to fix this. This is a little bit off the ground, obviously. And it's getting to be very close to being done. It's very cool. I'm going to save this. So I right click here, go to save as, get this dialog box. I like to save PNGs. I think they're quick, they're powerful. They can actually go up to 16 bits per channel, so you can get some pretty good bit depth if you need to do some post on it. And hit OK. It's saved. That's great. I almost like the original. I think it brings out the packaging more. That's very close. So in the next section, I'm just going to show you how to set your output settings, your frame size and all that, and save a rendered image to be shared. We're very close.